Let's talk about a number that contains an entire argument inside it. $43 million. That is what Vertex reported in CASGEVY revenue in the first quarter of 2026. CASGEVY is the first approved CRISPR-based gene therapy. It carries a list price of $2.2 million per patient, and more than 500 patients have started treatment since launch. By any normal pharma standard, that is early commercial progress on a brand new category of medicine. But here's the tension. There are roughly 60,000 eligible patients in the approved geographies. So the gap between who could theoretically be treated and who actually has started treatment is enormous. And the article we are covering today makes the case that this gap has almost nothing to do with the science. The science worked. CRISPR works as a clinical tool. The gap is operational, financial, and structural. And that distinction matters enormously for where the real investment opportunity in this category is going to come from. Point 1. CASGEVY is not really a drug. The article describes it as a multi-month coordinated services bundle that happens to include a drug substance somewhere in the middle. Before a patient ever gets infused, there is eligibility screening, psychosocial assessment, fertility preservation counseling, cell collection, manufacturing, release testing, conditioning chemotherapy, inpatient engraftment, and then years of follow-up monitoring. Almost none of that is a Vertex problem. It is a hospital capacity problem, a Medicaid coverage problem, a workforce problem, and a benefit design problem. The article makes the point that valuing gene editing companies without accounting for this is like valuing an engine without checking whether the rest of the car exists. Point 2. One-time cures break the operating system of modern healthcare. Everything in our reimbursement infrastructure, pharmacy benefits, prior auth workflows, rebate structures, patient support programs is designed around recurring transactions. A patient takes a drug repeatedly. The economics repeat with them. Gene editing inverts that completely. The clinical event happens once. The downstream economic value, avoided hospitalizations, avoided organ damage, avoided emergency visits, plays out over decades. The article frames the core problem this way. If a state Medicaid program pays $2.2 million today and the patient moves to a different plan in 2 years, that first payer never sees the savings they funded. The value is real. The ownership of that value is not settled. That is a structural problem, and it does not have a clean solution yet. Point 3. Intellia's Lonvo-Z situation is going to force this reckoning into the open. Intellia announced positive phase 3 data for Lonvo-Z in hereditary angioedema in late April 2026, with a possible commercial launch in early 2027 if approved. HAE is a condition where patients currently rely on expensive chronic biologic therapies. A one-time editor that potentially replaces that chronic therapy is going to force payers to make real decisions fast. Do you pay against lifetime cost of the alternative, against avoided emergency visits, against quality of life math, or against some kind of multi-year outcomes-linked annuity? There is no settled answer. There is no settled infrastructure, and that gap is the whole story. Point 4, and this is the one that tends to surprise people. Several of the biggest gene editing targets have enormous undiagnosed populations. For alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, one of the lead indications for next-generation base editors, roughly 100,000 Americans carry the most severe variant and only about 10% are diagnosed. That is not a marketing gap. That is a patient identification gap, a cascade testing gap, and a primary care awareness gap. The therapy can exist and still not reach patients because the infrastructure for finding those patients does not exist at the required scale. So where does all of this land? The article's argument is that the next cycle of returns in gene editing belongs at least as much to infrastructure builders as to editor platform companies. Patient activation, outcomes-based contracting, longitudinal registries that payers and regulators actually trust, reinsurance products designed for curative therapies, regulated genomic sequencing labs. These are the categories where the commercial bottleneck is most acute and where durable value is most likely to accumulate. The science is genuinely extraordinary. The business stack that lets the science reach patients has not been built yet. That is both the challenge and, for people paying attention, the opportunity. Subscribe to On Healthcare for the full paid written analysis, which goes deep on each of these infrastructure categories and what the semiconductor industry analogy tells us about where the foundry layer in gene editing is likely to sit. Link is below. We will see you in the next one. Subscribe to www.onhealthcare.tech for free and paid articles, podcasts, and more. For a further deep dive on the topic from today's video teaser, see the podcast and article link in the comments.